Welcome to part 2 of our Learning Narrated PowerPoint. In this part, we're going to go ahead and take a look at operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. So in other words, whether or not a behavior is repeated depends on whether or not there was a good outcome or a negative outcome. Let's take a look at a couple of differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, you are dealing with involuntary or reflexive responses and association between stimuli. For example, in 1904, a researcher named Edwin Twitmeyer classically conditioned the knee-jerk response. The knee-jerk response is when the physician would hit you on the knee with a little hammer and your leg jerks forward. So that would be the knee-jerk response. The way he conditioned this response was he paired a bell with the application of the hammer to create the response. So he would ring the bell, tap the knee with the hammer, and the leg would kick forward. Ring the bell, tap the knee with the hammer, the leg would kick forward. After several pairings, the bell itself was able to elicit the response of the knee kicking forward. So he classically conditioned the knee-jerk response. Just ringing the bell caused the knee jerk with no application of the hammer. This is an example of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning deals with voluntary responses and consequences of behavior. Instead of the response or actions of the organism being automatic or reflexive, the actions of the organism are taken on a voluntary basis. So the animal will voluntarily press a lever or do some type of response in order to get a reward. The reward would be a positive consequence of behavior, increasing the likelihood that that behavior would be repeated. So that's two of the main differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Are involuntary and reflexive responses for classical conditioning, and for operant conditioning, voluntary responses. And whether or not the behavior is repeated depends on the consequences of the behavior being either positive or negative. Operant conditioning was initially called instrumental conditioning by Edward Thorndike. He studied the relationship between actions and their consequences using something called a puzzle box. The term operant conditioning was put into play by B.F. Skinner. The definition for operant conditioning is a form of learning in which a behavior becomes more or less probable depending on its consequences. Thorndike's early research of behavior and their consequences led to something called the law of effect. The law of effect says that behaviors followed by a satisfying state of affairs is strengthened and behaviors followed by an annoying state of affairs is weakened. So what this means is that if you do something and there is a positive outcome, you are likely to do it again. If you do something and there's a negative outcome, you are not likely to do that behavior again. What happened?